So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody, and hi Ted, long time no see. So I have the pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker for the conference, Ted Miguel. You can see his publication records from the website and things. So what I wanted to add is so first Ted and I knew each other for a while. That is the very first generation, it's among the very first generation of students of Michael and Abhijit, of Michael Kramer and Abhijit Banerjee. And I had the privilege of being a student that was a teaching assistant then. And I think if development economics is now so popular in every grad school, and if research is as dense and diverse, deep and broad in the area of development economics, I think we need to know we all Ted and that first generation of development economists to have started the field or expanded the field in the econ department that joined, inspiring students and guiding students. I think we are very privileged to have you today talking to everybody why you got in this field. And just remind also that whatever the areas, this is what I'm also following for a few years, whatever area TES gets in becomes an important area. I'm not going to make a causal claim because this is what I've been trained to do, but whether it's research on Africa, whether it's research on conflict, and now recently research on refugees, I think that's a testimony of the importance of the field. And also, we'll be glad to hear your vision about where this is going. So Ted, the mic is yours. We will have 40 minutes. Please keep your questions to the end, and I'll moderate the discussion after that. Over to you, Ted.
Thanks so much. Can everybody see the screen okay? All right. Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And Tuan, thanks for the introduction. I've had the pleasure of knowing Tuan for a couple decades now, and just such an honor to be here today, and a pleasure to have Tuan moderating the session and having the conversation on this topic. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to speak with you all. I'll be talking about the issue of tracking refugee life outcomes with some initial results from the Syrian refugee life study. This is the product of work with a large team, including Sandra Rosso from the World Bank, Emma Smith at Harvard, and several other colleagues whom I'll mention along the way. But I really just want to acknowledge that this is a joint effort and just a great project to be part of. I'm very privileged. I'll start with an overview that I think everybody here is familiar with, which is just how important the issue of displacement is. Displaced populations are at an all-time high. There's so many tens of millions of people, living through displacement, most living in low and middle income countries. And for most of these individuals, displacement lasts a long time. So, most conflicts last many years, and the vast majority of people have been displaced for at least 5 years. And so this is, an important reality, and actually it's going to be very important for the points on research that I'll be focusing on, is just the issue of the sort of time frame that we're dealing with this issue. Unfortunately, because of climate change, the risk of armed conflict is likely to grow in the coming decades. Sal Shang, Marshall Burke, and I have some work on this, as do other scholars, and that could just add to these numbers in the coming decades. So this is not an issue that we kind of see going away in the next few years or in the next decade. If anything, there could be more and more risk of greater refugee and displaced populations. So this poses a number of challenges. The first challenge is simply collecting useful data on this very large population, a population that's often mobile, whether it's refugees, internally displaced people, These are populations that may not have a lot of trust in authorities, so it may be difficult to collect data, it may be difficult to access these populations. Then once we can collect data, there just remains so many unanswered questions about the appropriate policies, the appropriate approaches to improve refugee and displaced people's life chances. In many ways, even just characterizing the typical trajectory of life for many of these populations is something that we haven't done yet as a research community. And I will say, and this gets back a little to what Tuan noted before, that I'm new to work in this area. It's just in the last 3 or 4 years that I've begun to work on these topics, and I feel like I'm learning more every day. But what has struck me in reviewing the literature and learning what's going on is just, first of all, how many open questions there are in this field, but also how exciting it is that in the last few years, there's really been an explosion of research. And I do think that this conference is an expression of that, just the quality of the papers, the exciting new areas that the field is going in is really great. And it's wonderful to be part of a new research movement in this area. So in particular, I'm going to discuss in this study the issue of Syrian refugees and displaced people. The pre-war population of Syria was 21 million. And there's just a huge amount of Syrian population now living outside of Syria. About 7 million. Equal numbers are displaced within Syria. So it's just been a cataclysmic event, as I think we're all aware of. And you can see here just the numbers of displaced people based on UNHCR data, with many national groups having millions of refugees. But in Syria, the numbers are particularly stark. And so this is the population that I'll be focusing on. There is a growing body of research on Syrian refugees, and a lot of it is being presented at this conference, or at least some of it. A lot of that research has focused on host communities, on very important issues around how the influx of refugees affect economic outcomes, housing, education among host communities. And this is actually fairly common in the broader research literature on refugees. It's traditionally been easier to collect data and make progress, research progress, studying hosts, where there are kind of standard data collection, mechanisms in place. And it's been harder to make progress studying the refugees themselves very often. And of course, this is not for lack of interest. There's tremendous public policy interest and scholarly interest in refugee communities, but really there have been some data gaps that are just starting to be filled in. And again, in this conference, there are several studies that are starting to fill in those gaps. The Joint Data Center is a very big step forward as well. But again, there remains a gap. And in particular, the lack of high quality longitudinal data, panel data on refugee populations is a very notable gap in the literature. Of course, there's many reasons why it's been hard to collect that data. These populations are often highly mobile. They may lack trust in authorities. They may be difficult to access for various legal reasons. But without that kind of high quality long-term panel data, it becomes impossible to really understand typical refugee life trajectories. And that's something that seems really central, as a gap in the literature. And that's what I'll talk about today. So what I'm going to discuss today is some early evidence from the Syrian Refugee Life Study, SRLS, which is a study that aims to begin filling in this gap of a lack of longitudinal or panel data evidence. We have a paper with co-authors, and I've kind of listed the names here, that's forthcoming in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, with some initial results as we start examining the data that we've been able to collect over the last couple of years. And I'm going to review some of that data here today, but also kind of go beyond that to talk about some open questions and some other findings in the broader project. And the central goal of SRLS, this project that, together with the co-authors I mentioned, we're working on, is to try to improve our understanding of Syrian refugee life outcomes in Jordan using new longitudinal panel data. And a wonderful trend in the field is that several other teams are beginning to do the same thing among refugee populations in other contexts. And I'll come back to that later on. We need detailed data on refugee populations to answer just some basic questions. For instance, which refugees move and why? Which return home? Which move to third countries? And what are their motivations? And this is a central question. It's an important policy question. And survey evidence with survey questions that probe people's attitudes and intentions are really important to do this. We can't understand people's motivations just from administrative data alone. Second, what types of humanitarian interventions have the most positive impact on refugees' economic outcomes, their life opportunities, both in the short run and in the long run for themselves and their children? And finally, what types of policies and shocks affect people's well-being, their psychosocial well-being, and how do these effects persist over time? So, again, we're interested in life trajectories. We're interested in long-run outcomes. That's really critical for understanding these situations, but we can't look at these issues without long-term panel data. So what we're trying to do in SRLS is begin to create that kind of data. Of course, we're not in the long run yet. We've just started collecting data in the last couple of years, but we have to start from that building block. Okay, so there are two main sub-projects that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to mainly focus today on the construction of original longitudinal data. What we were able to do with very close cooperation from UNHCR, whom we're very grateful to, is create, get a sample, a representative sample of Syrian refugees living in Jordan. These are registered refugees. And we've started collecting data on them over time to create this panel data. It's typically been challenging to access this kind of data to create representative samples of refugees. But in the last few years, UNHCR has forged several productive partnerships to do this. And this is just a tremendous step forward, and will really enable us to get a representative picture of these populations. So far, in terms of data collection, we started one in-person round of surveys with very detailed survey instruments in 2020. We managed to collect about 500 surveys until that round was cut short by COVID. We simply couldn't remain in the field. We did pivot the project in 2020 into early 2021 to collect a phone survey round. It wasn't as detailed a survey, of course, but we did manage to collect some useful information on economic, health, and other outcomes. And then we're back in the field, literally right now, collecting a full in-person round in Jordan. We started just a few weeks ago in late December, and we'll continue for the next several months. So, again, we're beginning to create this panel with data in 2020, 21, 2022, and we hope to continue it going forward. The second component of SRLS so far, the major component, is an RCT, randomized controlled trial, studying the impacts of a housing shelter improvement program carried out by Norwegian Refugee Council, and trying to understand how these improvements in shelter affect life outcomes among Syrian refugees in Jordan. So far, we have some medium run impacts, 12 to 18 months after receiving assistance. There will be a presentation tomorrow that I'll mention that'll go into these in more detail, but I will briefly discuss these results today. So let me go through both of these, focusing mainly on the panel data set. We hope that this panel data collection continues. We've already put in place, as I mentioned, several rounds of both in-person and phone surveys. To date, there has been very little migration in our sample out of Jordan, but over time, we assume there will be more and more of this migration. And so one of our goals is to collect the kind of tracking information, personal contact, and family contact information to allow us to continue to survey these individuals, whether they return to Syria, move to a third country, or remain in in Jordan. In addition to that very detailed tracking information, the in-person surveys have very comprehensive data on a range of socio-demographic and economic variables. We have consumption measures, we have earnings measures. We also have very detailed information on health, well-being, education, child outcomes, and then a range of attitude and intention questions and preference questions to really build a rich picture of life. So I think for people who are familiar with some of the, what are called life surveys, like the Indonesia Family Life Survey, or, there's others around the world, we aspire to have a rich multi-use data set that will allow us to look at many different facets of refugees' lives. And let me just kind of quickly show you, I'm not going to go through row by row here, but just a sense of the kinds of household data, economic measures, consumption measures that we're collecting. As I mentioned, we had this in-person round in 2020 with around 500 surveys that was cut short due to COVID. The phone survey collects some of these major outcomes in terms of the household roster, living conditions, migration, economic outcomes. And now we're back in the field in person collecting all of these. Beyond these economic and demographic measures, there's also a range of detailed measures. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these rows, but education measures, preferences, mental health measures, and then a bunch of detailed child outcomes as well that we're collecting. So we're hoping that collecting this kind of panel data over time will have many uses. Understanding the associations between these variables can shed light on important issues. And again, as I'll talk about later on, we're hoping the research community as a whole can really benefit from access to this data, as well as policymakers. All right. So this is really the goal, the kind of high-level goal of the study. In the phone survey that was collected in 2020 to 2021, we managed to survey 62% of the sample, this representative sample that we selected. There were very few refusals. Most of the non-response was due to having outdated phone contact information. As I mentioned, we're back out in the field right now, in person. We're gathering and we're receiving updated phone contact information from UNHCR. We're able to use WhatsApp to contact a number of the respondents. We're finding some of the respondents. We're hoping to find them in person as well. So we're hoping that our response rate will just continue to rise, hopefully substantially above this level. Now that we're fully back in the field in person. Of course, the higher that rate of successful surveys, the more representative the sample. So this is something that we're excited to continue to advance in the current round. All right, so what are we finding so far? Let me transition from kind of the overview to start showing you some more data. The columns on the left are from the SRLS phone survey collected last year. We collected, 2,300 surveys, and this is just a kind of example of some of the data we collected. The right-hand columns are from the Jordan Labor Market Panel Survey, which is a national survey in Jordan, a very high-quality survey. It mainly collects non-refugee populations, but a small number of sample observations are Syrian refugees, about 400 something, and we're showing those numbers here. What you can see both from our data collected last year and from the JLMPS is that Syrian refugees' characteristics are quite different than non-refugees in Jordan, not surprisingly. They have larger household sizes, more children. They're less likely to be male-headed. There's a fair number of female-headed households due to the situation that these Syrian households faced when they fled the country. The Syrian refugees are also substantially poorer along a number of metrics. They're much less likely to have a permanent roof, piped water, access to electricity. So we can see that living conditions are harder for them than for the non-refugee population in Jordan. The amount that they earn is also substantially less than non-refugee populations as well. So there are a number of important differences, as expected between these populations. And I'll just say that, some of the value added in the SRLS is really just providing a much larger sample of Syrian refugees than what you could find in official Jordanian sources. Even though JLMPS is a very good survey and they do capture several hundred Syrian refugees, in SRLS we're capturing thousands of these households. So there's some real advantages to the data collection. So what else are we finding? In that partial first round of surveys in 2020, before things were cut short due to COVID, we managed to collect very detailed data on all those different dimensions that I mentioned before, including mental health measures. So one of the things that, of course, is a critical issue for refugee populations is mental health distress, is depression, anxiety, and we did collect a standard battery of questions, the CSD-10, to try to capture the likelihood of depression. One of our findings from that first partial round of surveys is that a very large share of the Syrian refugees in Jordan that we surveyed are likely to suffer from depression, 61%. So just a very high rate. Those rates are actually somewhat higher among females than males, 68% among females, 53% among males. So just a kind of staggering number. And of course, others have documented high rates of depression among refugees before, and we're confirming those findings. Something that's a little more novel, perhaps, is our ability to link that data to information on child outcomes. So we collected the Child Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which asks questions about child well-being outcomes, some of their socio-emotional outcomes as well. And this is an area of great interest for us. And in fact, in the current in-person round, we're hoping to continue expanding the richness of the data that we're collecting among children. What we were able to find out in that initial round of surveys is that the children of depressed parents also seem to fare worse in terms of their socio-emotional outcomes. So if you look at this table, and I know there's a lot of numbers here, there are really two sets of columns. The columns on the left are the average outcomes of children among the non-depressed parents based on this survey instrument. So their CSD score is lower. They don't have as many kind of answers associated with depression. The columns on the right are those individuals where their answers on the survey indicate they're likely to be depressed. And we have mothers and fathers here. And what you can see then for the different rows are the parents' responses about their children's potential emotional problems, conduct problems, problems with peers, socializing, where the normal row suggests the child is probably not suffering from too many problems here. And there's this very stark relationship that you can see throughout. If you look at emotional problems, about 70% of the parents who are not depressed, when asked about their children, say that their children's emotional development is normal, but among the depressed parents, it's only about 50%. So it's a very large difference. There's sort of similar patterns for conduct, especially for mothers. And then with peer problems at the bottom, again, a kind of similar relationship. For the children of non-depressed parents, about 60% say their children's outcomes are normal. For the children of depressed parents, it's only 30 to 40%. So very big gaps here. Now, look, there's a lot of potential reasons for these differences. There could be correlations in mental health outcomes within families. There could be reporting differences. But these kinds of very stark patterns really, I think, call for more research, that we're hoping to do, we're hoping others can do, on these differences. And, they really kind of, I think, demand more research and trying to understand how improving parents' outcomes and family outcomes can affect child well-being and development. Continuing on some of the data on children, we collected a bunch of other questions related to the integration of children into the host community. Did they socialize with Jordanian friends? Did they share recreational spaces, parks, or playgrounds with Jordanian kids? And here it's a kind of half glass full, half empty situation. The majority of the Syrian refugee kids do have Jordanian friends and play with them, but there's still sizable shares that don't. So only a little bit more than half of the Syrian kids share recreational spaces and parks, playgrounds with Jordanian kids. So there is the possibility of some social exclusion and kind of distance between the Syrian refugee community and Jordanians. Another set of issues that are very important here are the broader household social networks, how much adults socialize. We have some information on that as well. One possibility is that Syrian households return intentions, migration intentions, also partially shape how much they invest in relationships with the host community. And that's something we're interested in exploring more. We collected some detailed questions about return intentions, and we found some, I think, pretty interesting patterns. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the vast majority of our respondents have no intention of returning to Syria before the conflict is resolved. As long as the conflict is going on and there's a safety issue, they plan to stay in Jordan, and that's totally reasonable. When we ask them questions about their views on the conflict and return intentions, we asked them in 2020, we asked them, okay, in the next 2 years, do you believe the conflict is likely to be resolved? Very few thought it would be resolved, and of course it still hasn't been. So, they had correct beliefs there. What's a little more striking in our data is that only about half of the respondents say they would like to leave Jordan and return to Syria even after the conflict ends. So there's a large share of respondents who are maybe so pessimistic about what life would be like in Syria that they plan to stay in Jordan. So I'm going to show you that data in one slide. Of course, to the extent that a very large share of Syrians in Jordan are going to permanently live there, this has major regional implications, major implications for even just the population size of Jordan versus Syria. It could affect relations between those two countries, and there's obviously huge political economy implications within Jordan if the population composition of the country is altered permanently by the Syrian inflow. So let me show you some of these data. We asked respondents in 2020, will the conflict end in the next 2 years? Very few thought it would. Of course, they were right. And then we asked them, would you return in the next 2 years if the conflict is unresolved? And you can see here that most say it's quite unlikely or very unlikely that they will return. So maybe not surprisingly. Here's the data that I mentioned was maybe a little bit more surprising. In panel C, we asked, would you return to Syria within 1 year of the conflict ending? And the majority say it's unlikely or very unlikely that they will return. So again, the conflict ending, it doesn't mean that as soon as it ends, everybody's gonna go back. Panel D says, when the conflict ends, would you like to stay in Jordan? This is a little bit more open-ended. And again, only 54% say no. So this was a quite interesting finding for us, and certainly tremendous political implications. All right, so that gives you a sense, I think, of how this kind of rich data collection on attitudes, preferences, child outcomes, mental health, etc., can be tied together to really hopefully enrich our understanding of the Syrian refugee population in Jordan. The panel data set will also enable us to investigate the effects of other types of shocks, policy changes, and interventions. And I'll come back to that in a couple slides. The SRLS project was also set up to go beyond looking at the longitudinal aspect of the data to study the effects of an RCT. And actually, the RCT sample is a different sample. It's not drawn from this representative sample of UNHCR registered refugees. It was drawn from a sample of households eligible for assistance from the Norwegian Refugee Council. NRC carried out a shelter assistance program and was willing to carry out an RCT to randomize that assistance across different households. Of course, they had their own funding and budget constraints. Not every Syrian refugee in Jordan who needed shelter assistance could be assisted, and so an RCT was a natural way forward. If you want to hear the details on this project, check out the presentation tomorrow by my colleagues Emma Smith and Sarah Stillman. But I'm going to talk about some of those results today. I also want to mention that just in the last year or two, there's been this wonderful related stream of work using randomized control trial designs, understanding the effect of aid to Syrian refugees on their life outcomes. And I've listed some of the studies here. Some examining effects of assistance in Turkey as well. And this related subliterature focused on cash transfers. And our project focuses on housing assistance. Of course, both are tremendously important types of aid. So what do we find? Again, just preliminary results, because you can hear more tomorrow. The NRC Housing Assistance Program was a quite generous housing subsidy. It was an average of $2,200 per household over the course of a year. It was meant to subsidize rent. It also provided some assistance to landlords to do some upgrades to improve the quality of housing that refugee households were living in. We had some initial short-run results based on our phone survey. And when we do compare the treatment and control households, we find significant improvements in the housing quality in the treatment households. So that was like a very important finding, just to show that the intervention actually did what it was supposed to do, improving the condition of housing for these households. There were also some improvements in financial stability, some improvements in child school participation that we determined in that 6 to 12 month period. So this 6 to 12 month period is basically while the assistance is still being given out by NRC. We also found some unexpected patterns in the short run. We found that the treatment households that were receiving the housing assistance showed an increase in household size, mainly due to an influx of children. So it looks like some children were maybe from relatives or neighbors were moving into these households now that they had better living conditions. There were also unexpectedly some increases in certain measures of food insecurity. So meaning, that food insecurity got worse. This was unexpected. We weren't sure if maybe this was due to the increase in household size, but we didn't expect that. What we have that's preliminary and brand new, because we've just collected follow-up data, 12 to 18 month follow-up data on the RCT sample. These were in-person surveys, very detailed in-person surveys. And again, we're just analyzing the data, so it's hot off the press. We still find some improvements in housing, some reduction in housing expenditures because of the assistance, and we find some persistent increases in child school participation. So it looks like improving shelter characteristics through this transfer, which is also just a big, transfer of resources to the treatment households, does lead to some improvements in life outcomes for these households. That said, when we looked at things like financial stability, some of those effects dissipate. At the same time, we no longer find these sort of adverse food insecurity patterns 12 to 18 months later. So we're not sure if maybe that short run result was spurious or just something temporary. All right, so again, this is just preliminary evidence from the RCT, and you can hear more about it tomorrow when my co-authors present, but there's some indication that this housing assistance improves some dimensions of life, including for children, which is a big interest of our project. All right, so let me kind of move towards the end of the presentation. Fortunately, what we're doing in SRLS is not the only rich longitudinal data collection that's going on among refugee populations. For instance, there's some really interesting work, data collection of among Syrians living in Lebanon, and that work was, some of that work was presented this morning. I enjoyed the presentation by Daniel Masterson on this data, getting really into the details of what would drive migration, what would drive return intentions to Syria, and it was really a fascinating set of results. This issue of return migration, who returns, why they return, what happens to them when they return, still remains, I think, quite an open issue, and this study is starting to flesh these issues out. Fortunately, there's also a growing number of these surveys around the world, and a number of these data collection projects are actually focusing on some of the globally largest refugee and displaced people populations. So there's the Kenya Analytic Program on Forced Displacement, CAPFD, which is a project that I'm lucky enough to be involved in. This is a collaboration between colleagues at UNHCR, the World Bank, and also UC Berkeley that is going to be launched soon, collecting detailed information, panel data on refugee populations, both in camps and out of camps, and also on host communities living near camps and living in cities. So again, the hope here is to put in place a multi-year panel data set that hopefully can continue in the long run to really start understanding life trajectories of these populations. There's a large refugee panel survey of Venezuelan refugees living in Colombia that my co-author Sandra Rosso and co-authors are working on, that is also providing unique information on a very large and very important refugee population. Of course, Colombia has been characterized by having policies towards refugees and integration into the labor market that really set it apart from most other countries. Third, there's also the Cox's Bazar panel survey among Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. That's led out of a team based at Yale. Mushfiq Mubarak and colleagues are involved in that, again, with close collaboration from UNHCR and others. So it's exciting that actually between SRLS, CAPFD, the VENREPS, and the Cox's Bazar survey, there's some coverage, survey coverage, of 7 of the 8 largest refugee groups in terms of the source country of refugees, and hopefully taken together this new wave of panel data, and if we're able to pool this data, compare patterns across countries, et cetera, will allow us to characterize refugee life trajectories in a way we've never been able to do before. The data just hasn't been there to understand who stays, who returns, why. What could be done to improve life outcomes for children and their eventual integration either into host society, host community society, or into other societies. So, hopefully this data will be useful to scholars and policymakers alike. All right, so what are the next steps for us in SRLS? And I'll just start, wrapping up here. As I mentioned, we're currently in the field with our first full in-person round. Because our first attempt was cut short by COVID, and we did have a full round of phone surveys. We're very excited to collect this information. As I mentioned, there's a lot of ways forward for this data. Some of the things we're very excited about now is understanding the effects of camp residence on refugee life outcomes. We're surveying Syrian refugees, both who live in camps and who don't. We have a representative sample, and there are some issues around timing and policy that could be used to understand why certain individuals lived in camps and others chose not to, that we hope to use for econometric identification. That's one issue we're interested in. We're very interested in understanding social assimilation and integration and inclusion over time, and both through our surveys and through future surveys that will survey members of the host community. We do think that pairing surveys of refugee households and host communities is really very important for understanding that process of social integration. We're also, as many are in this area, interested in understanding the effects of direct conflict exposure among our refugee households on their life outcomes. So these are some of the directions that we're interested in within our own research team. But we really do feel that SRLS and these other panel data sets could be much more broadly useful to the research community and to policymakers, even beyond what we as a team are interested in terms of our immediate, article and paper writing goals. So one of the things we hope to do is make the SRLS a useful public good and to try to foster greater collaboration between our team and scholars globally. We've already actually held a conference in September, a kind of webinar. It had to be virtual among those interested in this collaboration, and we began to forge some really interesting relationships. This week, we posted all the data from that first 2020 survey round. So that is now publicly available for scholars and policymakers. You can check that out on our Harvard Dataverse site, and I put the web link up here. All of our current and future rounds will be made available, and we're hoping that even beyond any collaboration that we're involved in, that other scholars researchers and policymakers can use this data and make progress. So that's really our goal here. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting us, thank our funders at IPA and ultimately through the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office for funding. And especially, I'm grateful to all my colleagues who worked so hard with me to put together this presentation. So let me just leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ted. Imagine people are clapping and at home, but you just can't hear it. So we're going to move to the Q&A. The idea is to make it lively. Please raise your hands, and I will give you the microphone. Whether you're attendees or panelists, you can be given access to your microphone to ask your question directly. So while people are waiting, I'm going to ask the first set of questions. One will be a bit on the technical side. So we all know, and the research here, the research conference, this one and the one before, puts a lot of emphasis on econometric identification. That's what microeconomic research is about. And you know, when we hear about this project of yours, there's a lot of implicitly designed to avoid this or that pitfalls of econometric analysis. So could you walk us, and in the light of the few papers you've seen, can you walk us quickly over the main methodological challenges, whether it's endogenous selection, endogenous location, endogenous policies, so that when junior or less junior researchers set on a study like this, what do we really need to look out for?
Yeah, thanks, Tuan. I think that is essential. You know, in the research I saw earlier in the morning in the conference, and certainly in our RCT sub-project, we get around a lot of those issues through design, through RCT. And I think that is, when one can do it, that's obviously a very attractive approach. That said, the goal of the panel is to be a multi-use survey, even when we don't have RCTs. So you're right that that's something that's very much on our minds. It's something that I've been concerned about in this setting of conflict and refugees and displaced people. I've been concerned about for a long time. Something like 17, 18 years ago, I started working in Sierra Leone right after the civil war ended there. And I actually worked with colleagues at the World Bank to set up data collection there because of my interest in understanding the effect of conflict exposure on people's lives. So in some ways, the work I'm doing on refugees kind of flows from that broader interest. And we wrote several papers comparing life outcomes, comparing social capital, political engagement, et cetera, among those who had personally experienced violence in the Sierra Leone conflict to those who had not. And we had no idea what to expect in terms of the selection into experiencing that violence, being a victim. And many people, when we first discussed the issue, said, okay, the people who are experiencing violence are going to be so heavily selected that this comparison is going to be useless. And in fact, we faced a lot of challenges in publishing some of those early studies because I think referees didn't even give us a chance. They said, no, this is not an RCT. It's not well identified. We can't compare these populations. What we were able to do in Sierra Leone is collect a lot of detailed household data, not just on current outcomes, but we got a lot of retrospective data, pre-war data, et cetera. And we show that actually, at least in that context of the civil war in Sierra Leone, the people victimized and those not looked incredibly similar on a lot of different dimensions. So, and of course, that depends on the conflict, but at least in some conflicts, it may be possible to build out the data collection, including current and retrospective data, to make the case that those who are victimized, it's as good as random. It's very arbitrary in some conflicts. Who has to flee? Which direction the militia comes from, to this village or that village. So, in the case of the Syrian conflict, there may be some more complexity to it, and it's been going on. There's various sub-conflicts even within the conflict. So I don't want to say that it's as good as random, but that thinking ahead about that kind of data collection, I think for other researchers will be very important. When you collect data, think about the kinds of balance checks you're going to want to do to characterize that selection as well as you can. If there's selection, that's interesting. If there isn't, it may open up some possibilities for, for analysis. So I would say that's my advice. to scholars out there is really think through the specifications you're going to run and the kind of data you'll need to head off these concerns. You also raised the issue of policy, endogenous policy. This is a very challenging issue. And, I think, something we're struggling with. One of the things that we're thinking about doing with our data and that we've started to do is to look at camp openings and camp closures potentially, and the timing of those as kind of exogenous policy changes. So again, to the extent that there's a flow of refugees into, say, Jordan, or it could be, this approach could be used elsewhere, those who move in before a camp opens may be much less likely to live in a camp than those who move just after a camp opens, things like that. So I do think that there are possibilities of identification that we can exploit. And my own sense is these issues are so important that even if we don't have perfect identification, we should still be doing research on these questions. We shouldn't say we need a perfect RCT in order to study these populations. The stakes are too high. It's too important a set of issues. Let's make progress as much as we can, even if we have to make the case for identification and it's imperfect. So that's my general view.
Thanks a lot. So it's either me or people are still shy. So let me try also another question. So JDC, one of the mandates of JDC, the Joint Data Center, is to work with the World Bank, working with the UNHCR in a partnership, trying to make data more available and foster the kind of research that you're doing. You have had your own experience with UNHCR Jordan, and we had talked about this, but what do you think the efforts that JDC should be doing? How can this institution really enable you guys to do your work better?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we're very lucky that we managed to have a good relationship with UNHCR, and that's helped to kind of unlock this collaboration. I do think that the process of creating those relationships, I think it could be streamlined. I do think there's a lot of scholars out there, maybe, including junior scholars that may not have the links and the connections to the right people in UNHCR that could really benefit from those kinds of links. So to the extent that JDC can continue hosting conferences like this, host meetings where interested UNHCR research staff can meet interested external researchers and do some matchmaking around projects, I think that would be extremely useful to help streamline the relationship. I'm putting myself back in the shoes, Tuan, of what we were like when we were graduate students, back in the day. And it would have been just very hard to know how to begin. If I wanted to work in this area, what should I do? Where do I go? And I think it would be very nice for there to be a standard path, and for JDC to even have a page on their website saying, if you're a graduate student or a junior scholar and you want to work in this area, maybe every 3 months or 4 months, we're going to have a matchmaking meeting with researchers at the World Bank, UNHCR, policymakers who want to do this work together. Come join the matchmaking. Let's see where there's common interest and forge collaborations in a very open way. I know that these things are difficult sometimes to organize and time consuming, but the more of those activities that could occur, I think would be really valuable, because I still feel like the UNHCR data is really underexploited. There's been big steps forward, and we're seeing the explosion of research just through these initial collaborations, but I think we've scratched the surface, honestly.
There's something I didn't mention when I introduced you is one thing where I think you've taken the lead and has made an impact in our profession, is the ethics of doing research. I think transparency, I think the registries, the pre-analysis plans, and I think the profession should thank you for that. But now my question is something we've been struggling and discussion with the JDC is, what do you think the ethics of doing research in forced displacement? Sure, refugees are not the extreme case of prisoners who don't have agency, but we can see that they are vulnerable. They are in positions in a place where they might interpret that researchers have a say in their livelihood in the future. So how how do you think the research community should approach the question of ethics in doing research there?
I think it's a critically important issue. It's something we've thought about and grappled with on the SRLS team. And I see there's also a comment in the chat very closely related to your question here, Tuan. We are working on and writing up an ethics document related to our own work in SRLS. So, there's a question in the chat from Isabel about, could we write documents or create documents with examples or our thoughts on the ethics? We're actually working on that now. There's so many issues that come up. I'll mention one, which is we're hoping to continue this panel data collection for many years. And over time, presumably a number of our respondents will eventually move back to Syria. Some of them will. If the Syrian political context remains as closed and undemocratic as it is now, there could be risks to surveying people in Syria. There could be risks for them in terms of their own safety. How do we deal with that? Obviously, the safety of our respondents is far more important than us getting data. That's paramount. That has to come first. At the same time, are there ways, even in a politically repressive context, where we can collect this information safely? Are there encrypted tools or methods to collect survey data that's safe? Because the flip side of all this on the ethics is that collecting evidence and data to understand how to improve refugee lives, that is also very important. And there is also an ethical issue that we have as a research community to try to benefit displaced people. And I sincerely believe that data and research are very important in that effort. So I think we struggle with those issues. And they go beyond the normal issues we face in low-income settings, where there are also vulnerability questions. They go far beyond those issues.
So if you don't mind, I push that question a bit further, the beneficence thing. And people from the World Bank and UNHCR will I think, smile, because they know exactly what I'm talking about. So in terms of beneficence, the issue of refugees is so politically explosive that a piece of research can really affect the policy dialogue and can really have negative effects on the refugee community. So of course, in research, there is this sacrosanct division between knowledge and politics. But here, as you mentioned, that there is, inevitably there is a link between the two. And how do we behave in academia, or how should the people who are listening to us behave in academia when there's a tension between publishing, being quoted by the economist, because whatever is controversial is going to be quoted, and the real damage in terms of policy that might make on the ground. And I'm not going to quote all the issues that we're facing, but that's more than any other topic, I think, is a real issue. So how do we? What's your take on that?
I'm very. It's an issue of great concern, and my kind of ideological position on this is that more evidence, more data, more information should enhance the dialogue. But I see your point that something that could be misconstrued or a pattern in the data that makes a refugee population look bad, or if there, for instance, if there were evidence that migrant populations or refugee populations were more likely to engage in crime, it could feed into a kind of narrative, a domestic political economy narrative that's very negative. So, I'm sensitive to it. I don't feel like suppressing data or evidence in the long run is good, but I can see the concern. I think my fear with once we start kind of restricting what can be released or worrying about all the political implications is then the release of evidence becomes so selective and so biased that we can't even trust the research literature. So it's a very difficult issue, and I think there's sort of short run versus long run issues around the credibility of research that we have to put in play here. I think you're raising those. Sometimes these could be issues of life and death. So it's I think a very hard issue. I'm not going to take a hard stand.
I think you do it right. So Andres is having a question. Please go ahead, Andres.
Can you hear me? I think.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there I am. Thank you so much. Let me get back to one point you mentioned about publishing and kind of identification strategies, and I wanted to maybe push this forward, and especially for junior scholars. We're here, younger scholars. We have a couple of master students, of people that are starting their PhDs, and we know about this tension, right? In terms of publishing, especially in economics, we're trying to push forward towards identification. This is an academic conference, and we see a lot of very rigorous and creative ways to tackle identification to issues. But sometimes, in doing so, we kind of lose track of like the big questions, right? Sometimes even when we have the very creative and rigorous identification strategies, we're losing. We're identifying maybe local effects. We're losing kind of like the big picture.
Sure.
We often don't use descriptive statistics that much. So, like, especially for younger scholars, what's your take on how to balance this quest for rigorous identification, so that we can publish and we can advance in our careers, but at the same time in getting like broader scope of the actual real questions, the very important and foundational questions that matter for us to be contributing to help improve refugees' lives and displaced persons' lives.
I think you've put your finger again on something important, and it gets back to Tuan's first question. It's something that I think those of us working in this space have struggled with. I've struggled with this in the study of conflict in my older work. We had several papers on these issues of the effects of conflict exposure that got rejected from all the top 5 journals. People thought were maybe a bit of a waste of time because of some of these selection issues. Now, I think that body of literature over time has increasingly been seen as very important. It wasn't published in the top 5 journals. It didn't have the best identification, but the descriptive statistics and the patterns in the data were important. And then many other scholars ended up replicating some of our earlier findings in other studies. So there's sort of some stylized facts that emerged. I do see a lot of parallels with this work on displaced people, refugees, the humanitarian space. We're kind of in early days of that literature. It's only in the last few years that there's been a big explosion of work. A lot of the work may not have the best identification strategies, but we're putting empirical facts on the table. And I think if we believe as a research community that this issue is sufficiently important, then eventually there will be recognition that this literature matters, and there will be hopefully the kind of recognition in the scholarly community, of this work. But even if that recognition isn't there, I think if we believe in what we're doing, we believe it's very important, we know that this data is new, it's innovative, we should do this work and kind of have some hope and faith that there will be the recognition. I think what's also exciting, and again, this gets back to Tuan's just question a second ago, is even if in the academic journals there's some hesitation, the hope is among policymakers there will be recognition of the value of this data. And I think they're, subject to these caveats about controversy, this is an area of huge real world implications. And we can do our work knowing that there will be people listening to what we find. That's my hope, at least.
Ono has a very long question in the chat. Ono, if you don't mind, would it be possible for you to just ask it directly? I think you will need to raise your hands for the IT to know how to unmute you and mute you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Well, my question is that, as someone who's working in collaboration with the humanitarian agencies and doing active research since 2018, one issue that we continuously face, despite the fact that we kind of try to form the research question on the field through communication with the implementing agencies, is that most often the incentives for us, the scholars, the researchers, and the bureaucrats who work in these institutions do not align. In the sense that, they want to make decisions quickly, they want to convince the funders, and they want to show that what they do works, whereas we have a more cautious approach to research, and we want to observe later outcomes, long-term outcomes. We want to have good data, and we want to have larger data sets and so on. and it's understandable from their perspective that what they're struggling on a day-to-day basis in a conflict zone. And whereas like the researchers, they want to see a better vision of the work that can be generalized to and communicate with the scholar audience. So my question is, what is a better way to align these incentives in a sense that we can improve the more transparent and evidence-based research that come from the field with the research questions that both help the institutions to improve their work and also improve the quality of the research that we're conducting? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. One thing that we've found helpful, I think, in our collaborations here in this space, but I think it extends into other branches of development economics, where again, some of our implementing partners and collaborators have different time horizons and different interests. It's very important to establish what you can get out of your data in the short run that's valuable to your partners. So if you can establish that, look, even in the baseline survey, there's some descriptive statistics that they're interested in that they may not be able to collect easily on their own. They may see value in the collaboration there, even if those sorts of descriptives in the short run are only maybe 10% of what interests me. I may be interested in other questions. I may be interested in the longer term data. Because your point is very well taken. I'm thinking of our experience even with collaborators in Jordan, with NRC. We've had a great collaboration with UNHCR. There's been a lot of turnover, which you mentioned, and maybe that leads to some kind of short-term incentives among our partners. So, but we've been able to give them information that's useful to them, we hope, and share things with them that they find valuable, even if they're not totally sold on the long-term vision, or maybe they're sold on it, but they don't benefit from it in the same way that we do.
So on those wise words, I'm going to close the keynote session by thanking you, Ted, a lot for the time and the effort you make to come and talk to us about your research, your vision, your views about different aspects that touch us all on our professional life. You also have very nicely accepted to spend time on. Oh, 1 second. I'm informed that Bjorn has a question. So Bjorn, please. And then I'll finish my thank you note.
Thank you, Tuan. Thank you, Ted. That was a great keynote. You really raised the bar here. I find so many good and inspiring messages. So kudos. One of our priorities at the Joint Data Center is to work on responsible data access, making existing data available by through various means. And I was so pleased to hear how you're making the data for your study public already. That's great. It's an example many should follow. My question to you is that looking at the number of papers that have been reviewed for this conference, a lot of them focus on displaced people in middle-income countries. There's an overrepresentation of Turkey, of Jordan, of Colombia, in relationship to where the really big challenges are, you could say. And I'm thinking of some parts of Africa, not least in the Sahel. And there are good reasons why I think economists find it very difficult to do, and others who want to do their quantitative research. It's just a lack of data. And so what do we do about that? That we get more deep research, solid research on those most difficult countries. And related to that, if we want to have data, sustainable, strong data, we need to get the national statistical offices involved. Right? We talk about statistical inclusion. We heard from a representative from the Central African Republic, the DG for the NSO. any advice you have for us on how to do that successfully, how to engage them successfully, be really good to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bjorn. I mean, I completely agree with that point, and certainly looking at the program, your observation is totally right. I've been really, again, fortunate to be able to partner with colleagues at the World Bank and UNHCR for this new project in Kenya. Now, Kenya isn't the poorest African country, but certainly a lot poorer than Jordan or Colombia. And there, we're hoping to start filling in some of the gaps with big refugee populations in East Africa. I've been very impressed by the degree of engagement that my colleagues at the bank and UNHCR have had with government of Kenya, with statistics agencies there, how we're really working very hard as a team to integrate our data collection, the survey instruments with the very specific questions and types of data that the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics is collecting. And so I think in that sense, it's really, for me, been a very impressive process and shows what can be done with enough commitment, between different partners. And it's a very complex project. Again, the bank, UNHCR, UC Berkeley, other academics, internationally, and government of Kenya partners. So I think it certainly can be done. And within development economics, over time, we've become good at collecting data, even in some very poor countries, some of the poorest countries in the world, some of the poorest sub-Saharan African countries in the world. I'm thinking of Sierra Leone, for instance, et cetera, have very robust kind of data collection systems in place by academics, a lot of partnerships with Statistics Sierra Leone, et cetera. So I do feel like it's possible, and but the collaboration between academics, UNHCR, the JDC, and the World Bank is going to be so central, really building strong collaborations there, just because I do feel that the UNHCR and bank colleagues have a comparative advantage in forging durable links with government. So I'm hopeful it can be done. I'm hoping what we're doing in Kenya is a step forward, but it's still like the first few steps. There need to be many more such projects.
Thank you very much, Ted. So I'm going to conclude the day today. And so Ted has nicely accepted to stay for half more hour in the other breakout room. I think the link is in the chat box. I strongly encourage people who do not know Ted to take this opportunity, just either to say hi, introduce yourself, explain quickly what research you have been doing. The others who know Ted very well, of course, you're welcome to come, but please let this opportunity for people who don't have maybe the facility to be at conferences and things to have an opportunity to interact with Ted during this half hour. Thank you very much. The day was great, and looking forward to tomorrow.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Ted. Bye. So just move to the other room, Ted. And,
okay, I can leave this. Okay, let me leave this room then. Yep. Okay. Thanks a lot, Tom.